This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system quietly losing the ability to contain its own violence. What you are watching, whether you realize it or not, is the erosion of a rule that has governed power for centuries. The idea that what happens inside a country stays inside a country. That line is thinning. And when it breaks, it does not break loudly. It breaks operationally. There is a moment when internal force stops being a domestic choice and becomes a trigger. When repression is no longer just repression, but a signal, a condition, a switch. That moment has already arrived. You may feel like this is far away. It isn't. Because once violence becomes conditional, once outside power is waiting for a cue, the system is no longer stable. It is reactive. And reactive systems don't pause. If you want to understand what happens next, stay with me. Because the mechanism matters more than the headlines. And the mechanism is already moving. What actually controls this system now is not ideology. It's not faith. It's not even fear. It's liquidity. This is the part that gets missed. States like this don't survive on belief. They survive on cash flow, continuous, predictable, just enough to keep the machinery running, pay the security forces, fund the courts, keep the lights on in the places that matter. When that flow is steady, repression is cheap, routine, almost boring. When that flow becomes fragile, everything changes. Because a government that lives paycheck to paycheck cannot absorb disruption. It cannot pause. It cannot afford hesitation. Every decision becomes short-term. Every response becomes sharper, more violent, less flexible. That's when control shifts from leaders to mechanisms, from strategy to reflex. And here's the dangerous reframing. This is no longer a contest between protesters and a regime. It's a system trying to finance its own enforcement while multiple pressure points tighten at once. Money, labor, information, violence. When those align, stability becomes an illusion, and the system starts reacting instead of governing. That reaction is already visible, and it leads directly to the quiet shift that made this moment possible. What changed wasn't sudden. That's why it worked. Before, force was internal, contained, predictable. A government could calculate how much violence it could use, how fast, how publicly, and still survive the reaction. The math was familiar. Repression in, condemnations out. Then silence. Now that equation is gone, the shift was slow enough to feel normal. External actors stopped reacting after violence and started warning before it. Not with diplomacy, with conditions, with timelines implied but never stated. That's the dangerous part. When threats are vague, they're dismissible. When they're conditional, they're operational. Before, internal crackdowns were a domestic tool. Now, they're a trigger. Before, shutting down streets restored control. Now, it invites scrutiny. Before, cutting communications meant darkness. Now, it just reroutes the signal. Nothing dramatic announced this change. No treaty, no declaration, just repetition, precedent, signals that landed and then stayed. And slow change is the hardest to resist, because by the time it feels real, the old defenses no longer work. The system didn't notice the ground moving under it. It just noticed that its usual responses stopped producing the same results. That's when small shocks start behaving like crises. And the first one was already enough to expose the fault line. The shock didn't arrive as ideology. It arrived as arithmetic. A currency collapses, and suddenly the system has to explain itself in numbers. Prices jump, savings shrink, wages freeze. What used to feel abstract becomes personal fast. It starts quietly. People gather over money, not politics. That matters. Because economic protests don't ask for permission. They don't need leaders. They don't wait for consensus. And here's the mistake systems like this always make. They treat the first eruption as the whole event. They move to suppress the symptom instead of reading the signal. Force comes out early, hard, public. That's when the protest mutates. What began as a demand for stability turns into a demand for replacement. Not reform, not adjustment, replacement. This is where violence stops working the way it used to. Every strike meant to restore order instead widens participation. Every arrest multiplies witnesses. Every casualty changes the language people use to describe what they're living through. And outside the borders, the reaction is immediate, not outrage, attention, calculation. You can feel the shift when officials stop asking what happened and start asking how far this goes. If you're trying to follow this in real time, this is the moment to stay close. Because what looks like a domestic crisis is about to reveal something much larger. Here is where the story stops being emotional and starts being mechanical. Because systems like this don't fall when people protest. They fall when the math stops working. The hidden mechanism is simple and brutal. The state does not repress on ideology. It represses on payroll, salaries, fuel, logistics, overtime, ammunition, court throughput, prison space. All of it costs money. All of it assumes continuity. That continuity runs through one narrow channel: production, export, revenue. When that channel narrows, loyalty becomes conditional. Not philosophically, practically. This is why labor matters more than slogans. Why certain workers carry disproportionate power without ever leading a march. If production slows, the system doesn't weaken later. It weakens immediately. And here's the part most people miss. Repression accelerates the damage. Every escalation increases cost. At the exact moment, revenue becomes uncertain. More force, more pay, more risk, less flexibility. So the regime keeps squeezing, not because it's confident, but because it's cornered. It cannot de-escalate without signaling weakness. It cannot escalate without burning cash faster. That's not a stalemate. That's a countdown. And once that countdown starts, outside actors don't need to intervene to change behavior. They just need to wait for the mechanism to strain itself. What comes next isn't theory. It's acceleration. The second crisis doesn't unfold. It compress, shorter timelines, less warning, fewer options. Communications drop, then reappear, fragmented, uneven, enough to leak, enough to prove visibility never fully went away. That matters because repression without darkness is expensive and risky. Every action has an audience. Every delay compounds uncertainty. Casualties rise on both sides. Not enough to end it, too many to ignore it. Courts harden, sentences sharpen, no flexibility, no exit ramps. That also matters. When a system removes leniency, it removes surrender. It forces everyone inside it, enforcers and protesters alike, into binary choices: continue or break, escalate or collapse. And outside the system, the language shifts. Not outrage, not condemnation, calibration. You can hear it when officials stop speaking in hypotheticals and start speaking in conditions, when responses are no longer tied to intentions, but to thresholds. This is the dangerous phase, the one where speed replaces planning, where decisions are made to avoid worse outcomes and accidentally produce them instead. Nothing has resolved. Nothing has peaked. But the margins are gone. And once margins disappear, the next move doesn't belong to the system anymore. Up to now, this can still sound abstract. Systems, mechanisms, thresholds. So let me bring it back to you. Because the pressure doesn't stay inside borders. It never does. When a state loses the ability to manage violence cheaply, the costs don't vanish. They move into markets, energy prices, migration routes, security budgets, attention spans, yours. You feel it when instability stops being a headline and starts showing up as volatility. When decisions made under pressure ripple outward, fast, uneven, unpredictable. And there's something else, something quieter. When governments learn that internal force can trigger external retaliation, they don't become gentler. They become faster, more opaque, less accountable. They shorten the distance between decision and action. That's the lesson that travels. This isn't about sympathy. It's about exposure. A system proving that once violence becomes conditional, no one really controls the escalation. Not the protesters, not the regime, not even the outsiders watching closely. If you're still here, it's because you sense this isn't finished. It's because, the human cost isn't just counted in casualties, it's counted in what becomes normal next. Stay with me. Share this if you want others to see what's actually happening underneath. Because what follows doesn't stay local. This is the point where the map stops being helpful. Because once a system like this destabilizes, the effects don't radiate evenly. They jump, they skip, they land where the pressure is already high. Energy markets react first, not dramatically, subtly. Risk premiums creep in, insurance costs rise, shipping routes get recalculated, nothing breaks, everything tightens. Then diplomacy follows, not statements. Positioning, silence where there used to be reassurance, activity where there used to be restraint. And here's the critical shift. Other governments start watching not the protests, but the response. They study the thresholds, the signals, the timing. They learn what kind of internal violence now triggers external consequences and what kind still doesn't. That knowledge travels fast. This is how local crises become templates, how one confrontation teaches others what is now possible, what is now risky, what is now permitted. The old assumption was that sovereignty absorbed internal chaos. The new reality is that chaos leaks. And once it leaks, it rearranges alliances without announcements, it forces choices without votes, it creates pressure where none was expected. Nothing has tipped yet. But the system is no longer contained, which means the future doesn't arrive gradually from here. It arrives in branches, and those branches are already forming. From here, the future doesn't narrow. It splits. There are 3 paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment, controlled release. The system absorbs just enough pressure to survive. Revenue stabilizes, enforcement becomes selective. Violence drops below external thresholds without disappearing. On the surface, it looks like restraint. Underneath, it's recalibration. The structure remains, the lesson is learned, and it waits. The second path is erosion. Slower, messier. Pressure never fully releases. Cash flow stays unstable. Control becomes inconsistent. Authority fragments. Decisions are delayed until they're forced. No single moment breaks the system. It just stops working the way it's supposed to. People adapt, institutions hollow out, power leaks sideways, and then there's rupture. That's the path everyone talks around. The one where multiple thresholds are crossed at once. Economic shock, labor disruption, visibility that can't be shut off, violence that triggers an outside response. Not occupation, impact, the kind that removes options instead of adding them. Here's the crucial point. None of these paths require intent. They only require timing. Reactive systems don't choose futures. They stumble into them. And right now, the system we're watching has lost the ability to slow itself down. That doesn't mean it collapses tomorrow. It means the margin for error is gone. And the next decision by anyone matters more than it looks. And this is where I stop short on purpose. Because systems like this don't end with clarity. They end with recognition, often late, that something fundamental has already changed. What you should be watching for now is not collapse, not victory, not announcements. Watch for normalization. Watch for how quickly extraordinary measures become routine, how conditional threats become background noise, how the idea that internal violence can trigger external force stops sounding shocking. That's the danger. Once that shift locks in, it doesn't reverse easily. It becomes a precedent. Other governments study, other movements test, other powers quietly plan around. No one needs to intend the next escalation. The structure is already doing that work on its own. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because you can feel the unease, the sense that this isn't a single crisis, but a demonstration, a rehearsal, a proof of concept for how authority breaks in the modern world, don't look away now. Not because something dramatic is about to happen, but because the absence of drama is how this hardens. If you want to understand where this leads and how often this pattern repeats next, you'll want to keep going with me. Subscribe, share this, stay alert, because the most dangerous systems are the ones that still look like they're holding. And this one hasn't finished showing us what it's become.